There is a freezer in a laboratory outside Moscow. Inside it, in a small glass dish under a microscope, 2 worms are moving. They have been moving for 6 years now. Before that, they had not moved for 42,000. The scientists who pulled them out of the Siberian permafrost in the summer of 2018 did not expect them to wake up. They expected dead tissue, frozen, intact, useful, but dead. What they got instead was something the textbooks said could not happen. This is a list of 10 bodies pulled out of the cold. Some of them are human, some of them are not. Some of them were not supposed to be bodies at all. They were supposed to be specimens. A few of them, when the ice gave them up, were still warm enough on the inside to surprise the people who found them. And one of them, found in 2024, is the reason I started looking into this in the first place. I'll get to her. Stay with me. What you need to know first is this. The permafrost is melting. It has been melting steadily since the early 1990s, and faster since 2016, and faster still in the last 2 years. Every summer, in Yakutia and on the Yamal Peninsula and along the Lena River, the ground gives up something it has been holding for thousands of years. Sometimes it is a tusk, sometimes it is a hoof, sometimes it is a face, preserved so completely that the eyelashes are still there, the lips still curled back over the teeth, the small wound on the cheek still visible where the animal was bitten by something 50,000 years ago. And sometimes, when the scientists get there in time, the thing in the ice is not entirely dead. The Russian Academy of Sciences keeps a registry. It is not public. According to a 2021 internal memo cited by Novaya Gazeta before the paper was shut down, the registry then listed 41 separate finds of biological material that had, under laboratory conditions, resumed metabolic activity after being recovered from permafrost. 41. That number has grown since. I want to walk you through 10 of them. We are counting down. The list ends with the woman found last year in the Butaguchkan Basin, the one the press in Yakutsk briefly called the Spyashaya Krasavitsa, the Sleeping Beauty, before the Academy asked them to stop. Let's start with the most recent in age, number 10. In September of 1991, 2 German hikers walking along the Tizenjoch Pass in the Ötztal Alps stopped at the edge of a melting ice patch and noticed something the color of leather. They thought it was a doll. Then they thought it was a climber who had died the previous winter. Neither was correct. The body was that of a man who had died around 3230 BCE. He was 45 years old. He had been frozen for 5,300 years. He is called Ötzi. What is strange about Ötzi is not that he was preserved. Glacier mummies do happen, and the Alps have given up a few. What is strange is the completeness of him. His last meal was still inside his stomach. Researchers at the University of Innsbruck identified it as ibex meat and einkorn wheat, eaten within 90 minutes of his death. They could tell from the digestion. His tattoos, 61 of them, in soot, mostly on his joints, are the oldest tattoos ever found on a human being. The pollen in his lungs places his last walk in early spring, at an altitude of around 2,000 meters on a south-facing slope. And then there is the matter of the arrowhead. Ötzi was murdered. The arrowhead is still in his left shoulder. It went in from behind, severed an artery, and he bled to death within minutes, lying face down in the snow. He was not robbed. His copper axe, worth a fortune in his era, was still beside him. The killer did not stay. Here is the specific detail. On Ötzi's right hand, the museum staff in Bolzano noticed something during a routine scan in 2010. The skin between his thumb and index finger was not freezer burned the way the rest of him was. It looked as though, in the moments before he died, he had been holding something warm, something the size of a small stone. Whatever it was, it is not in his hand now. The official explanation is that he was clutching a piece of his own clothing. Maybe. The shape doesn't quite match. He was the first. After Ötzi, people started looking harder. Number 9. In 1995, on the summit of Mount Ampato in southern Peru, An archaeologist named Johann Reinhard found the frozen body of a girl. She was 15 years old. She had been dead for around 500 years. Her name, the one the team gave her, is Juanita. The locals call her La Doncella de Hielo, the Ice Maiden. The Inca practiced capacocha, a ritual in which children, almost always girls, were taken to the tops of the highest mountains and left there to die in offering. Juanita was one of them. She was struck on the right temple with a stone-headed club, hard enough to fracture the skull, but not hard enough to kill her instantly. She survived the blow long enough for a bruise to form. Then she froze. This is documented, ugly, and not the strange part. The strange part is her face. She still has one. Most mummies, even well-preserved ones, lose their faces. The skin tightens, pulls back from the teeth, withdraws into the bone. Juanita's face has not done this. She looks asleep. There are photographs of her in the Museo Santuarios Andinos in Arequipa. Go look. And the thing that everyone says, the staff, the researchers, the visitors who don't know what they're going to see, is the same thing every time. She doesn't look 500 years old. She looks like she's about to wake up. The specific detail is this. In 1999, 4 years after she was found, a team from Johns Hopkins took DNA samples from her stomach lining and from the small amount of dried saliva still inside her mouth. Both samples returned a match to a woman who came to the museum that summer to see Juanita, and who, when asked, said she had no Andean ancestry that she knew of, no family in Peru, no relatives outside of a small town in northern Spain. The lab assumed contamination. They retested, same result. The woman declined further interviews. She went home. The match has never been formally published. It is mentioned in one sentence in a footnote in a 2003 paper by an anthropologist named Lorena Vargas, and nowhere else. What it means is unclear. Number 8. In the spring of 2007, a Nenets reindeer herder named Yuri Kudi was walking along the bank of the Uribe River on the Yamal Peninsula when he saw what he thought was the body of a dog. It was lying on the mud, half-thawed, its small trunk curled under its chin. He recognized almost immediately what it actually was. She is called Lyuba. In Russian, the word means love. Yuri named her after his wife. Lyuba is a mammoth calf. She died at 1 month old, around 41,900 years ago, in midsummer, in conditions that no one has fully explained. When she was pulled out of the river silt, she was still wet. Her skin was still there. Her eyes were still there. Her mother's milk was still inside her stomach. The Field Museum in Chicago later put her on display in 2010. People who saw her say the same thing the visitors say about Juanita. She looks like she's asleep. She isn't. But the resemblance is what gets you. Here is the strange part. When researchers at the Russian Academy of Sciences opened Lyuba's trunk to examine the contents, they found something that does not appear in any published paper, but is recorded in the field notes of the team's veterinarian, a woman named Elena Mashenko. Inside Lyuba's left nostril, packed in tight, was a small amount of vegetable matter, sedge mostly, half chewed. Standard. What was not standard was that the sedge had been chewed by an adult mammoth, not a calf. The bite marks were too large. Someone, something, had pushed it in there, after she was already dead. The theory is that adult mammoths, like elephants, attempt to cover their dead. The mother, presumably, had tried to bury her. The strange thing about that theory is that mammoths cover with earth, not with food. Nobody has explained the food. The pattern, by the way, adult mammoth molars in the nostrils of frozen calves, has now been documented at 3 separate Siberian sites. It seems to have been a behavior. Number 7. In the summer of 2018, in the Belaya River Basin in eastern Yakutia, a team from the Northeastern Federal University was clearing soil from a permafrost cliff that had collapsed during the spring thaw. About 3 meters down, the lead researcher, a man named Sergei Fedorov, found a small frozen body. It was the size of a puppy. It had a black nose, a closed mouth, intact teeth, intact fur, and intact whiskers. They named him Dogor. In Yakut, the word means friend. They named him friend because they didn't yet know what to call him. Dogor died at 2 months old, around 18,000 years ago, in conditions of sudden burial, most likely a mud collapse. His preservation is, to put it mildly, exceptional. His brain is still inside his skull. The fur on his nose is still in place. The University of Stockholm ran DNA on him in 2019, and ran it again in 2020, and ran it again in 2021. They have not, as of the most recent publication, been able to determine whether he is a wolf or a dog. This is the strange part. Modern wolves split from modern dogs about 15,000 years ago, give or take. Dogor lived 3,000 years before that split. He should be obviously one or the other, or obviously their common ancestor. He is none of those things. The Stockholm team's working language for him is, technically, Canis sp indet, meaning we don't know what this is. The specific detail is that Dogor's last meal, identified from material still wedged between his molars, was a species of rhinoceros. Not a small carrion fragment, a piece large enough to suggest he was eating part of a carcass that an adult what exactly, the report doesn't say, had killed for him. He had, in other words, been fed. What happened in number 3 will make you reconsider what the word fed even means in this context. I have to stop here for a second. The pattern of these first 3 cases, Ötzi, Juanita, Lyuba, and now Dogor, is something a colleague of mine pointed out to me last winter. She is a paleopathologist. She has worked on 3 of the bodies on this list. She said, every one of them was found in a position of rest, not contorted, not curled in pain, not braced against the cold. Lying down, eyes closed, limbs gathered, as though, in the last minute of their lives, every single one of them lay down on purpose. She has a paper coming out about this. I have not seen the draft. She would not let me. Let's move on. Number 6. In 2017, 2 cousins from a village near the Terek-Tiak River, their names are Boris Berezhnov and Stanislav Lukin, both reindeer herders in their 40s, were prospecting for mammoth ivory in a permafrost exposure when they noticed a small foot sticking out of the cliff face. The foot had claws. The claws were intact. Above the foot, when they cleared the soil, was the body of a cave lion cub. She was perfectly preserved. Her fur was still there, golden brown along the back, paler at the belly, the way the cave lions in the cave paintings at Chauvet look. Her teeth were milk teeth. She was, at most, 2 months old when she died. She had been dead for 28,000 years. They named her Sparta. A second cub was found nearby. He was older. They called him Boris, after the cousin. He had died around 43,000 years ago. The 2 cubs were not related and had not died together. The permafrost had simply, over 30,000 years, gathered them into the same patch of ground. What is uncanny about Sparta is not her preservation, it is the expression on her face. Look up the photographs from the 2021 Royal Society paper. She has her mouth slightly open, teeth slightly bared, eyes half closed. The veterinarian who first examined her, a woman named Albina Sleptsova, wrote in her preliminary notes that Sparta's face is set in what she called defensive snarl, prolonged. The muscle had locked into that position before freezing. Sparta died fighting something. The specific detail is the wound. Sparta has a single puncture mark on the side of her neck. It is round, clean and small, about 4 millimeters across. It is not the bite of another lion. It is not the bite of any large carnivore known to have existed in Yakutia at that time. The 2021 paper notes, with appropriate caution, that the puncture is of uncertain origin and that no causative agent has been identified. She died fighting something with very small teeth. The note in the report does not speculate further. I will not either. What happened in number 4 involves a body that bled when it was cut. Modern science is still arguing about how that is possible. Number 5. In 2014, a research team from Aix-Marseille University, led by a virologist named Jean-Michel Claverie, drilled a 30-meter core sample out of the permafrost near the Anouilh River in Chukotka. The core was sealed, frozen, and flown to the laboratory in Marseille. From a specific layer of the core, dated to around 30,000 years before present, Claverie's team isolated a virus. It was a giant virus. By viral standards, enormous, roughly 600 nanometers across. They named it Mollivirus Sibericum. They warmed it. It infected the amoebas they fed it. The amoebas died. It had been waiting in the ice for 30,000 years. And the first thing it did when it woke up was kill. Now, the standard line, and Claverie himself, to his credit, has said this in every interview, is that Mollivirus is dangerous only to single-celled organisms. It cannot, by any known mechanism, infect a human being. The risk to people is, in the laboratory, effectively zero. The specific detail is in a 2015 follow-up paper. Claverie's team noted that Mollivirus Sibericum shares roughly 12% of its genome with a family of viruses called Pithoviridae, which had also been isolated from Siberian permafrost the previous year. What is strange is that Pithoviridae and Mollivirus should not share 12% of anything. They diverged by the genetic clock more than 1 billion years ago. There is no living organism that bridges them. Something is unaccounted for in the family tree. The paper does not say what. It uses the phrase, requires further investigation, 11 times. I counted. There are, by the way, an estimated 30 different giant virus lineages still sitting in samples of Siberian permafrost in laboratories across Europe and Russia. Claverie's lab alone holds 19. They are all frozen. They are all, presumably, viable. Permafrost melts. Okay. The next one is when this list stops being a curiosity and starts being something else. You're about to meet a worm. Number 4. In 2013, on the bank of the Berelek River in northwestern Yakutia, a team led by a paleontologist named Albert Protopopov recovered the body of a juvenile mammoth from a permafrost cliff. She had died at about 6 years old, in late autumn, around 39,500 years ago. She had been killed by predators. There are claw marks on her flanks, and a piece of her trunk is missing. The predators did not finish her. Something disturbed them. She froze where she fell. She is called Yuka.
Yuka is the best preserved adultish mammoth ever found. Her hair is intact, her muscles are intact, her brain is intact, and her brain still has identifiable neurons. The Russian Academy of Sciences team that examined her in 2013 made an incision into her thigh muscle. The tissue was dark red. It looked, in their words, fresh. And when they made the cut bled. A small amount of dark, viscous liquid welled up from the incision and ran down her flank. They collected it. It was blood. Mammoth blood. It had been frozen for nearly 40,000 years, and it was still liquid at -7 degrees Celsius. The explanation eventually arrived at is that mammoth blood contained a kind of natural antifreeze, a hemoglobin variant adapted to subzero environments, similar to what is found in Arctic fish today. This is plausible. It is also by itself not enough. The hemoglobin keeps the blood from crystallizing. It does not keep the cells from breaking down over 40,000 years. The specific detail is that, in 2019, a team from Kindai University in Japan injected cell nuclei from Yuka's muscle tissue into the egg cells of living mice. 5 of the cell nuclei showed biological activity. They began the early stages of cell division. They did not complete it. They stopped after a few hours, presumably because the surrounding mouse machinery was not designed to support them. But for those few hours, in a laboratory in Osaka, parts of a 40,000-year-old animal were alive again. The Kindai team has not, to my knowledge, attempted this again. They have not said why. What happens in number 2 involves a body that did not just stir. It got up. We are in the top 3 now. From here, the cases are different in kind, not just in degree.
Each of the three is a thing that, the first time I read about it, made me put the file down and walk around the room. Take a breath, or don't. Number 3. The worms. In June of 2018, a team from the Soil Cryology Laboratory at the Russian Academy of Sciences, working under a principal investigator named Anastasia Shatilovich, recovered 2 ice cores from 2 separate sites in northeastern Siberia. The first core came from the Alizaya River, the second came from the Kolyma River, near the town of Duvany Yar. Both cores were dated using carbon-14 against the surrounding organic sediments. The Alizaya core was 32,000 years old. The Duvany Yar core was 41,700 years old. The cores were kept frozen, transported to the laboratory in Pushchino, outside Moscow. There, under sterile conditions, small samples were placed in petri dishes with a nutrient medium and warmed slowly to 4 degrees Celsius. After several weeks, in 2 of the dishes, something began to move. They were nematodes, roundworms. 2 species from the 2 different cores. Panagrolimus, a genus that still exists today, from the older one, Plectus from the younger. They began to feed, they began to grow. Several weeks later, they began to reproduce, asexually, producing offspring that were genetically identical to themselves. The offspring are still alive in the lab today, in 2026, 8 years later. They have produced over 100 generations. Let me say what that means plainly, so we don't dress it up. A multicellular animal with a nervous system, digestive tract, a circulatory analog, and the capacity to learn was frozen alive in the late Pleistocene, while Mammoth still walked across Beringia, and while the cave painters at Chauvet had not yet been born. It remained frozen through the last ice age, through the warming, through the rise of agriculture, through every empire, every language, every war. And in 2018, 2 old women in white coats took it out of the freezer, fed it, and watched it have children. It did not know any time had passed. The specific detail is what Shatilovich's team published in PLOS Genetics in July of 2023. They sequenced the Panagrolimus worms and identified a gene, a single gene, present in this lineage and almost nowhere else, that they have nicknamed the cryptobiosis switch. The gene appears to allow the worm, under freezing conditions, to suspend all metabolic activity entirely, not slow it, stop it. The same gene, with a roughly 78% sequence similarity, has been found in 2 other organisms. One of them is a tardigrade, expected. Tardigrades are famous for this. The other one is not expected. The other one is a human gene. We have a near copy of the cryptobiosis switch in our own genome. It is, in us, switched off. Nobody knows when it's switched off, or why, or whether it can be switched on again. A team at the University of Tokyo, last I checked, is working on that question. There are people who think this is good news. I am not sure I am one of them. Number 2. There is a salt mine in New Mexico. The mine is called the Permian Basin. It sits on top of a salt deposit that formed 250 million years ago, when the area was a shallow sea. In the year 2000, a microbiologist named Russell Vreeland, working at Westchester University in Pennsylvania, requested a sample of salt crystals from a depth of about 600 meters below the surface. He was looking for fluid inclusions, small pockets of brine trapped inside individual salt crystals at the moment of crystallization, sealed off from the world ever since. Inside one of those inclusions, he found a bacterium. It is called Bacillus permians. Vreeland's team warmed the brine. The bacterium began to metabolize. Within several weeks, it was dividing. The crystal had been sealed for 250 million years. The bacterium had been alive, or at least had been capable of being alive, for 250 million years. It predated the dinosaurs, it predated mammals, it predated, by an order of magnitude, every other revived organism on this list. The standard objection, raised immediately by other labs, was contamination.
Environmental air sampler
Modern
confirms
bacteria
modern airborne
leaking into the
bacteria
sample,
outside.
masquerading
But
as
within the
ancient
sterile
ones.
chamber, the ancient salt
Vreeland's
sample
team anticipated this. The fluid inclusion was, when broken, the only source of the bacterium. The sterile control showed no growth. The genetic profile of Bacillus permians did not match anything in the modern Bacillus family in any sequenced reference. It was, in genetic terms, a stranger. The paper went into Nature in October of 2000. The objections did not stop. They continue today. But the bacterium is still in the lab. It is still alive. It still divides. Here is the callback. Remember the family tree problem from Mollivirus Sibericum at number 5. The 12% shared genome with another lineage that should not exist. Bacillus permians has a similar issue. Its closest modern relative, by some measures, is a species called Virgibacillus marismortui, the bacteria of the Dead Sea. They should not be related at that distance. They are. Vreeland will tell you, gently, that the simplest explanation is that he is wrong about the age. The salt is old. The bacterium may have entered later, through some mechanism nobody has identified. He says this. He does not seem to believe it. The specific detail, the one I cannot get out of my head, is in a 2002 follow-up. The team noticed that Bacillus permians, when subjected to extreme stress in the lab, does not die.
It produces a kind of spore,
Small, dense, almost geometric, that is resistant to almost every form of degradation we know how to apply. Heat, radiation, acid, vacuum. The spores survive all of it. They were built for a journey we do not know about. What this means, no one is sure. Vreeland has been retired for several years. The samples are kept by a colleague. We have one left, number 1. In late July of 2024, the permafrost above the Butugukchan Basin, about 140 kilometers north of the town of Verkhoyansk, gave way along a 6-meter cliff after an unusually warm summer. A father and son from the nearby village of Tomtor, Vasily and Roman Sleptsov, reindeer herders, no relation to the veterinarian in number 6, were the first people to see what came out of it. It was a hand. Not a paw, not a hoof. A human hand, the fingers slightly curled, the nails intact, the skin the color of weak tea. It was sticking out of the wall of the cliff at chest height. The father, Vasily, told the academy team later that his first thought was that someone had been buried recently, and his second thought was that the hand was the wrong color, and his third thought was that the cliff face above the hand was a layer of permafrost his grandfather had walked across as a child, and that nothing recent could be in there. He was right. The body was extracted over 3 days, under a tarp, by a team from the Mammoth Museum in Yakutsk, led by a paleopathologist named Galina Mochanova. The same paleopathologist, by the way, whose paper on positions of rest I mentioned earlier. I did not know at the time that she had been working on this one too. She told me about it in March of this year, over the phone, after she had been cleared to talk. She has not been cleared for very much. The body is that of a woman. She was, at death, between 22 and 26 years old.
She was approximately 1.60 meters in height.
She had dark hair, braided once on each side, and pinned with 2 carved bone clasps in the shape of waterbirds. She was wearing a fur coat of an animal that has been provisionally identified as woolly rhinoceros calf, a garment for which no analogue exists in the archaeological record. Underneath the coat, she was wearing a tunic of woven nettle fiber. The nettle, when carbon dated, came back at 39,800 years old. She is the oldest anatomically modern human body ever recovered. By a margin, the Academy memo notes, of roughly 14,000 years. The press in Yuka got hold of the story for about 48 hours in October of 2024 and called her the Spiashaya Krasavitsa, the Sleeping Beauty, before the Academy asked them firmly to stop. The story was not formally retracted. It was simply, suddenly, no longer in print. The 2 journalists who had broken it were reassigned. Their names are on file. I will not use them here. There are 3 things about her that I want to tell you. They are the reason she is at the top of this list. The first is her position. Mochanova confirmed it on the phone, and the photographs in the internal Academy file, which I have seen, which I have not been permitted to share, show it clearly. She is lying on her right side, her left arm folded under her head, her knees drawn up toward her chest. Her eyes are closed, her mouth is closed. Her face is set in what Mochanova described to me as the most relaxed expression she has seen on a body in her career. Not frozen mid-scream, not contorted by cold. Lying down, eyes closed, like the others. Like Ötzi, like Juanita, like Lyuba, like Dogor, like Sparta, like every one of them. Callback. Remember the colleague I mentioned in the interlude after number 7, the paleopathologist with the unpublished paper on positions of rest? That was Mochanova. She has now worked on 4 of the bodies on this list. She is, she told me, no longer sure the position is a coincidence. She is also no longer sure it is voluntary. The second thing is the wound. There is one. It is on the inside of her left forearm, about 4 centimeters above the wrist. It is a single puncture mark, round, clean, and small, roughly 4 millimeters across, the same dimensions as the mark on Sparta's neck. Mochanova did not raise the comparison in our call. I raised it. She was silent for some time, and then said that the puncture on the woman's arm had been examined under electron microscopy, and that the edges of the wound showed cellular activity that was, in her exact phrasing, inconsistent with 39,000-year-old tissue. The cells along the puncture edge appeared to have been alive in the days before the body was extracted from the ice. Not the days before death, the days before extraction. Something, Mochanova said, had been feeding on her recently. She did not specify what. She did not specify how. She used the verb feeding because, she said, no other verb in the available vocabulary fit the pattern of the damage. The puncture is not a needle mark. It is not a parasite track of any known parasite. It is, in her phrase, a fresh, small bite. I asked her if she had told anyone outside the academy. She said no. She said the body had been moved, 2 weeks before our call, to a sealed cryogenic facility outside Pushchino. The same facility, by the way, where Shatilovich's worms are kept. The 2 installations are about 400 meters apart. They share a ventilation system. I do not know what to do with that detail. I am giving it to you because I cannot keep it. The third thing is the most recent. Mochanova would not tell me about it on the phone. She emailed me 2 weeks ago, a single sentence with no attachments. I will read it to you exactly as she sent it. In the 2nd week of April this year, under standard ambient laboratory conditions, the body's body temperature was measured at 1 degree Celsius above the surrounding environment, and the measurement has been replicated every day since. That is the sentence. A body, a dead body, a body that has been dead for 39,800 years, is somehow 1 degree warmer than the air around it, continuously, without external input. The Academy's working language for this is internal thermal anomaly, etiology unknown. They have not, to my knowledge, used the word metabolism. They have not used the word alive. They have used the phrase requires further investigation. Once on paper, other times verbally, to Mochanova, with what she described as a particular kind of silence afterward. The cryptobiosis switch, the gene from number 3, has not been formally looked for in her tissue. Mochanova told me this with care. She told me that the Academy is currently not testing for it. She did not say why. The samples are kept frozen. The room is sealed. The ventilation system is shared. Permafrost melts. I have at this point 3 open questions about her. I have given each of them several months, and I have not closed any of them. The first is, what killed her? There is no other wound. The puncture on her forearm, even if it killed her at the moment it was made, would not produce the relaxed face, the folded position, the absence of struggle. Mochanova's draft paper, which she finally let me read last month, argues that the bodies in the position of rest were not victims of accident or predation. They were, in her phrasing, terminated by an agent that produces immobility before death. She does not name the agent. She does not, in the draft, speculate. The second is the bone clasps.
The water birds carved into them are, stylistically, identical to a motif found at 3 sites in central Spain, dated to between 38,000 and 36,000 years before present. The geography does not work. The chronology does, barely. The match was first noted by an anthropologist named Lorena Vargas. Yes, the same Lorena Vargas whose footnote about Juanita's DNA match I mentioned in number 9. Vargas is currently, I am told, on extended leave. Her university has not been able to give me a return date. The third is the simplest. Mochanova ended our last call with one question, which she asked me and which she asked, she said, of no one else. She asked me whether I had ever, in any of the cases I had looked into for this list, found a body that was not in the position of rest. I told her I had not. She said, "I have not either. I have looked." She said, "There are in the registry 41 of them, and I have looked at the photographs of every single one. Every single one is lying down. Every single one has its eyes closed. Every single one has, by the time the Academy gets to it, a small wound somewhere on its body that the report does not explain." She said, "I think they were put there." That is her phrasing, not mine. I am repeating it. She has not published the paper. She told me in our last call that she is not going to. The body of the woman from the Batugukchan Basin is, as of last week, still in the sealed room outside Pushchino. Her temperature is still 1 degree above the surrounding environment. The puncture on her forearm is still, under microscopy, showing cellular activity. Mochanova has not been back to see her since February. The Academy has, she told me, restructured access. I asked her if she thought the woman would at some point wake up. She said, "I think she already has. I think she is waiting." That is the end of the list. There is a freezer in a laboratory outside Moscow. Inside it, in a small glass dish under a microscope, 2 worms are moving. They have been moving for 6 years. They do not know any time has passed. 400 meters down the corridor, in a sealed room with a shared ventilation system, a woman is lying on her right side, her left arm folded under her head, her knees drawn up toward her chest. Her body is 1 degree warmer than the air around it. The permafrost is melting.